I don't.
Further round 5. VTR 4831, take 1.
Tonight we're going to talk about women and relationships. Ariana, you've written a book and you've also done a great deal of broadcasting on the subject. Do you feel that women's expectations have changed? And if so, how do you feel that these changes have affected the relationships between women and men?
I feel they have changed, and the area that interests me particularly is the way that women's expectations of themselves have changed. So that now we see that women are prepared to take risks, to venture into areas which were regarded as male preserves, to expand themselves in all sorts of ways which previously they might have regarded as impossible. And inevitably, that has affected their relationship with men. Because so long as women felt emotionally or financially dependent on men, then they could never really have a healthy, real, free relationship between them. And only really when a relationship is based on that kind of freedom and choice can it be healthy and growing.
But aren't most women still, certainly most married women, still at least emotionally entangled and very often financially dependent on men?
Yes, many of them are, but I think what has changed is the feeling that they don't have to be. Many women can be supported by men and still feel free. It's not a question of them being self-supporting so much as the feeling that they could have the ability to go out on the marketplace, get a job and support themselves.
But that's not true of many of them, is it? I mean, because of the structure in which they've grown up, because they haven't got the same training, because often they've got children, because there aren't facilities to look after those children, and because men haven't accepted their share of parenting yet. Surely the reality for many of those women is that while the expectation has grown up, while they see a minority of women having freedom, for the majority, their lives haven't changed even if their expectations have.
I think in many cases we have to realize that women are prepared to take responsibility for their own lives, and that's really the key. For centuries, not just for years, women have seen themselves as victims, the victims of society, of conditioning, of men. And the fundamental change, the change that I think is the most fascinating of all that's happening at the moment, is that women are prepared to say that, yes, maybe conditioning is against us, maybe social structures are against us, and nevertheless, we can make it, we can do what we want, and we can go beyond conditioning and expectations from men or from society.
But isn't that, I mean, that seems to me to be saying that, which I think is true, is that women now have two jobs. If you have a career, if you have a life outside the home, and because men haven't accepted their role in parenting yet, that we have two jobs, and that we have to be even stronger than, or even better than, to be able to succeed in the outside world and to be our own people.
Well, 2 points about that. First of all, I think that many men have accepted and are accepting more and more parenting. Many of them actually enjoy looking after children. And I think that's one of the healthiest changes in the last few years, the breaking down of the stereotypes. How many more men are prepared, for example, to show their vulnerability or to cry or to do any of these things which were regarded as taboos. And in the same way, many women are prepared to assert themselves, to appear powerful and to take decisions and to do all the things which were regarded as quote-unquote unfeminine. Mm.
But do you think, what about men and men? I mean, it does seem to me that you're right as far as women go, that women are saying, we want more. I'm not sure if I agree with you about men taking on an increased role for parenthood. I think that they're men of our generation who have been, by and large, booted into it by strong women who have said, OK, chum, your easy ride is over. Those people have, and I think they've got a lot out of it, and I think they've started on a journey which is a creative learning experience. However, I know from my male friends, for example, that they will come and talk to me about their psyche and their eternal condition in a way that they will talk to other women they know and love, and in a way they will not talk to other men. And I think relationships between men are at a pretty low ebb.
That's a very interesting point. Actually, I hadn't thought of it before, but now that you mention and you give that example, I can see that. And I think that may be because among men, a lot of other men are still not willing to show that they are exploring new possibilities, that there is a feminine side in all men. I think that's the most interesting thing that's happening, that many men are acknowledging their feminine side and many women are acknowledging their masculine side. That
One of the problems with this is that it requires society to take account of it, that if men are going to be allowed to be equal parents of their children, then their employers have to take this into account. You have to have much more flexible arrangements. It has to be much easier for a man to say, have to bring his child into work or to have to take a day off and maybe make it up at some other time. At the moment, amongst employers, that's entirely unacceptable. They don't accept it for their women employees, and they're very reluctant to employ women quite often for this reason. And they certainly don't expect it of their men. I mean, a man who said, I'm sorry, I can't come into work today because I'm looking after my children, it would be regarded as absurd.
Or my child is sick, therefore it's my responsibility to stay at home, is almost unheard of from men.
Yes, I think that it would be regarded as absurd in some companies and not so absurd in others. And basically the only way I see that changing is by those men who want to take a more active part in the bringing up of their children, to make sure that that happens in their own company. I mean, it has to happen company by company and community by community. I don't believe that that's the kind of change which can be brought about by legislation or by rules from above, because then companies and employers will always find a way around, employ different people, or find generally a way out of what they don't want to do. But the thing that interests me very much really comes from something that Sue said about the way that men and women participate more and more together in the bringing up of their children and in the exploring of themselves, because that's another aspect of the same thing. It isn't just in their relationship to their children, but in their relationship to themselves, that they are prepared to take risks and move beyond the conventional expectations.
Arianna, if I may say so, tonight you've been talking about choice for women. You've been talking about men giving up some of their stereotyped maleness in a way that would please most good female radicals. And yet your name is red rag to a bull to many women who are active in the women's movement. And you got a reputation from your book, from The Female Woman, of being in some way opposed to women's liberation. Now you talk tonight about women showing their maleness more, and yet you call that book The Female Woman. And it seemed to be a lot about femininity, as that being some key to women being happy. Why do you think you're misunderstood, if that would be your explanation of this?
Well, I wouldn't say that I was misunderstood. I would say that when The Female Woman came out in 1973, the atmosphere was so charged that because I attacked the extremism of the women's liberation movement, and specifically attacked the way that they made a lot of women who chose to stay at home and have children feel guilty, as though they had taken the inferior decision, because of that, the book was hardly ever read. I mean, the book was attacked without it being read.
But I read it.
I read it too.
And it made me angry at
did,
the time. And I don't think that I'm an extremist in the women's movement, and I don't think Sue is either.
But what is interesting is that when you said about my talking about femininity and calling the book The Female Woman, the point I was really making was a point which I would still make, and even more so, which is that when we talk about feminine qualities, at least when I talk about feminine qualities, I talk about the intuitive side of both men and women. And I felt that it would have been a great danger if that was thrown out because of the women's liberation movement, so that women began to ape men instead of realizing that that side of our lives and of our character is incredibly precious. It's what society lacks. It's what we should try and encourage in men rather than, get rid of.
I'd agree with that. And I read your book, like Helene. I got very angry about it. I mean, first of all, I thought that in that book you were stereotyping the arguments of what has only ever been a very small minority amongst feminists and saying that was the argument of the women's liberation movement and then knocking it down. And for me, the motivating force in changes between men and women, and for example now, saying to the men that I know and love, okay, I love you, it is time for you to start fighting battles with other men to change them because that's your responsibility in your province, it's something I can't do. That motivating force for me is feminism, and it is about saying, I am a woman. There is something totally positive about being a woman. And it's those positive features that we want to bring to bear in the world and we want to use to change the nature of the mess that men have created in our institutions and in our society. And I felt that you were being very unfair to the very nature and being of the women's movement. I mean, I don't want to dwell on that because that's past history, yes. But it does seem to me that we're now saying that there is something that is very positive about this feminine quality. And I also think on the other side that the women's movement has now come round to saying that the one thing we haven't really grappled with is motherhood and our positive qualities in the world. And it seems to me that you are saying that far more now than I thought you were 6 years ago.
Well, I don't know when you read the book, whether you read it then or now. I don't know whether you read it recently.
Fairly recently, actually.
But as I think you're right in saying there's no point in me trying to defend the female woman. What I would say, just to sum it up, is that the main theme of what I said in The Female Woman is the main theme of what I would say now, which is that the important thing is for women to be able to choose whether they want to have a career or not, whether they want to combine a career with a family or not, and for society to make it possible for them to make that choice. Now, when you said earlier that many women have to do 2 jobs effectively now, I agree. But at the same time, many women get so much fulfillment from the job they are doing that they are prepared to make the extra sacrifices that may be involved in combining it with a family. And I know, on the other hand, of the case of a friend of mine who decided to give up her job when she had her children. And gradually she became so resentful, even though she wouldn't acknowledge it for some time, that even running a home and a family became difficult and too demanding, simply because the more fulfilled you are, the more you have to give. And the less fulfilled, the less you have to give.
But you seem to be welcoming all the changes that have happened, the widening of opportunities for women, the fact that we have now got more choices than we certainly had 15 years ago. And yet at the same time, you seem to attack the very movement that brought this about. It seems to me that the women's movement, in all its various different branches, is really largely responsible for the way in which things have changed recently. And I wondered if you agreed with that, or do you feel that you seem to be attacking it? A lot of people say, I'm not a woman's libber, but, and then they agree with everything that women's lib stands for. They just don't like the idea of being labelled.
First of all, what is the women's movement? Where is the women's movement? Where at its headquarters or its president? There isn't such a thing as the women's movement.
But quite rightly there isn't.
Yes, of course. But when we talk about me attacking the women's movement, I mean, this is simply untrue. I have attacked consistently the extremism of the women's movement, the people who glamorize work, who make a 9-to-5 job appear as the ultimate objective for a woman.
But that's what you just did. You just glamorised work, and I was dying to get in and say to you, but for most women, they don't get fulfilment out of going and sitting on a production line.
No, but I didn't glamorise work. I gave one instance of one friend of mine who happened to have a fulfilling job and was prepared to make the effort of combining it with a family. I didn't make any general statements.
Oh, but that came from a general discussion which suggested that fulfilment came from work.
No.
And it's,
I didn't say that at all. I don't believe that fulfillment comes from work. I believe that fulfillment comes from all sorts of areas. And those women who find fulfillment from their family should never be made to feel guilty.
No, I mean, what you were saying before was that for some women, and maybe it was for some women, but they were the only women of whom you gave instances, they got the energy for 2 jobs, the energy for the home, from the stimulation for work. Now that seemed to me a long way from the typical working woman in this country who does a shift in a factory and comes home and makes her husband's tea and does the children's washing.
I don't think, Helene, that makes a lot of difference what the job is. We all know that most men's jobs are not particularly fulfilling. Very small proportion of the population are lucky enough to have jobs that are in themselves enjoyable and worthwhile and intellectually satisfying. Yet we know what the results of unemployment are. The people who are unemployed are by and large people who don't have jobs that appear to be particularly fulfilling. And I think women are like the unemployed. They are socially alienated. The women who don't work are cut off from any sense of where they belong in society. Nobody is paying the money and saying, you are worth this. Nobody is giving them a whole alternative part of society to belong to, a sense that they're doing something for which they're paid, which is identifiably useful. And I think when you're cut off from that, as when you're unemployed, you get very lost in society. An awful lot of women who stay at home the whole of their lives become very withdrawn.
Well, I wouldn't accept it at all, and this is precisely one of the things that I was against in the female woman, this attitude. I don't believe that women who work are alienated, who don't work are alienated from society. I don't believe that women who have children feel that they are not doing anything useful, and if that happens, then that's a tremendous indictment of society. If they have made motherhood and bringing up children seem like an inferior choice and an inferior decision.
But you see, one of the problems is that it is, I mean, the whole world of work is based on the idea that a man goes out to work and earns the family wage, and when a woman goes out to work, she's working for pin money, and that therefore her whole proper role in the world is parenthood, and that a man is not a parent, he's a worker. That's the way that
and he
the
never
world
has
of work.
to choose.
He never has to choose. Now, a woman does have to choose, and I think those choices are agonising, because I do believe that people love their children, and I believe they want the best for their children. But if you are only there working for pin money, you're not a proper person at work, you're not a proper person in the home, because that's the way the world structures it. Because you do not have access to the stimulation of being geared into the way the world works. Now, I think that's
into a factory job,
world.
like the ones that Helene mentioned, is that the thing that you need to get stimulation from?
Unfortunately, that is all the stimulation that the vast majority of people have in their lives, male or female.
You see,
I think really, may I just answer that point? What I feel you're in danger of doing so is not having enough respect for women. Because basically, women have the ability to break through their conditioning. I think one of the greatest dangers is for us to say that because of the conditioning, that's how we are and that's why we have to stay. And I believe that one of the greatest realizations we are all making is that it doesn't matter how much conditioning we've had, it doesn't matter how terrible our upbringing has been, we can break through. Because especially with the advent of psychoanalysis, many people are now using the way they've been brought up as an excuse for not doing this or that, for not being happy or everything. So we can find endless excuses, or we can take responsibility for our lives and stop playing the victims.
But one of the ways in which women are beginning to change and are beginning to break out of their conditioning has been now that I think it's something like 75% of married women now go out to work, not because they necessarily believe in the sort of things we're talking about, but because they really have to, because of the economic situation. In doing this, I've come across a great many women who have, in a sense, broken through their conditioning just in the act of going out to work. They found themselves working with other women. Perhaps some of them have become shop stewards and have got themselves involved in politics or in organisation of one kind or another, and have suddenly found themselves capable of doing and thinking things that they'd never regarded as their province before. I mean, obviously this doesn't happen to most women just because they get a job, but it does happen, and quite often starts out with having quite a boring job, and you suddenly say, well, I'd like to be forelady. Maybe I'll get up into management, and maybe I'll go to evening classes. But unless you set foot outside the home in the first place, it's rather unlikely that that sort of break in your view of yourself is going to happen. That your view of yourself as a housewife is always rather low and humble. Maybe you're right and it shouldn't be, but as society is at the moment,
but
it is.
You can set foot outside the home and go directly to the evening class. You don't have to go to the evening class via the factory. And the thing that interests me here about relationships especially has to do with the way many women have been made to feel guilty if they don't look after everything to do with the family and their job, and that constant feeling that they never do enough, which so many women suffer from. And that's why I like trite sayings, and I have one of them on my wall in my study opposite my desk, where I say, take care of yourself so that you can take care of others. And I think really every woman should remember that unless we begin with taking care of ourselves, we will never be able to really take care of others, whether they're our immediate family or society or the community, without resenting it.
But the problem is that to think about yourself as an autonomous individual, someone who has identity and personality, you must be more in the world than just a help agency for others. And it seems to me that the way that our society works, the skills of child rearing are skills that are totally devalued. They're not seen as skills for a start. They're seen as some natural extension to the personality of woman, and you become reduced to those facets. Now, if a man had to look after children, it would be the learning of a skill and would be and is seen professionally with men who work with children as the learning of a new skill. Now, first of all, I believe that women's skills are devalued. Secondly, I believe that women need as much stimulation in the world from outside sources to be able to see themselves as an integrated personality as men need. And I think it's women who are deficient in those things. The world doesn't allow women those things. Now, it's not just a matter of, I don't think you can step from that personality that's disintegrated by the world and by your responsibilities into going to the evening class. I think maybe you do need the stimulation of going to even the factory, to begin to see yourself from the outside, to see you are a person, not just a help agency for others.
Or at least, even if you're only a cog in the factory wheel, you're a different cog. You're in with that particular group of women doing that particular job, and it's different to being the mother in the home. I have done it, yes. You have actually worked in a factory? Yes, I've spent many months. I can't say I've enjoyed it, and I've done it as research. I don't think it's enjoyable, but I would say that rather than not work at all, I would rather do some form of work.
I find that an amazing statement. I find it's like saying that women have no resources inside them at all, so they have to go out in the world to get stimulated.
No, I don't think
it's like saying that you're empty.
Would you say
need
that to an
outside
unemployed
stimulation?
man? Would you say to him, why are you worried about being unemployed, apart from the financial side?
I think this is a red herring, Polly, it really is. I mean, if we want to bring up the whole issue of unemployment, it would be a different programme.
But Arianna, not all women have children. Not all women have a full-time stimulating job at home, as childcare can be. And I admit there are problems about perceptions. There are problems that people go out to work because they get paid to go out to work, and it's poverty at home, and also that money means we're into the cash nexus, and money means that you're doing something valuable, and if you don't pay someone to look after children, then there is a lack of self-respect. I admit people go out to work for adult company because people can go mad at home with small children, particularly people who don't have the support of a husband around. But what infuriates me is the assumption that there is in women some ability to care for children, some natural ability. If a man stays at home, you say he's unusual, you say he has a gift, you know, he wants to do it, he has a motivation, he's a very good father, he's a good parent. Society seems to me to turn around and get its childcare on the cheap and on the bad, by assuming that if a child is at home full-time with a mother, the child must be getting the optimum care. And it's not true. There are children at home being emotionally deprived, physically battered, full-time with mothers. And we don't care about that because we have this assumption that if they're at home, the women are all right and the children must be all right as well.
So what do you suggest should happen? That the children should be brought up by the state?
No.
Whichever one is best at it should do it.
Or there should be support. But I'm not saying the state should bring up the children, but I'm saying that how our children are brought up, we think it a responsibility in education, we think it a responsibility if there's physical violence, that the well-being of the child, yes, is a concern. And just as some women want to work and some don't, some women need help, whether it's from playgroups or childminders or anything else, in their job of looking after children.
Absolutely.
That's all I'm saying.
But I mean, that's so obvious as to seem to me.
If it's so obvious, why don't we do it as a society?
But do you think that marriage is going to survive all this? Do you think that these changes are going to produce such frictions in relationships between men and women that marriage is going to not be possible in the way that we're used to it now?
I don't think so. First of all, the statistics prove that marriage is thriving. And as we love symbols, men and women, I mean, a marriage is really a symbol of committing ourselves totally to a relationship. I mean, we don't have to be married to commit ourselves to a relationship, but part of us seems to be looking for that symbol. And what is interesting is if you look about the tendency of film stars, say, to get married about 10 times. It's almost as if, because they need that symbol of commitment even more than ordinary people, they tend to get married without much thought, simply in the hope that the act of marrying will ensure a continuity.
Why can't we throw away the symbol and concentrate on the other human beings who are involved in our relationships, recognise their autonomy, recognise the love and warmth between you and the trust and the confidence, and work that out in a rational way that doesn't force people into playing stereotype roles?
Well, I think that one of the reasons why I love living in 1980 rather than in 1880, let alone 1580, is that if I choose not to be married, nobody's going to come and do anything to me. If I choose to live with someone, that's absolutely fine. If I choose not to have children, that's fine. And if I choose to have children, not be married, that's fine too. And that freedom is there. Now,
except there's a cost to that choice.
I don't feel any cost.
The
I'm not
career woman
married.
who doesn't want a child, for example, I mean, I think it's a very difficult choice to make because children do give so much. But to make that choice between having a career or a child, or trying to combine the two and feeling the guilt about that, is a very difficult thing.
Do you think there's no question any longer about people being left on the shelf, women panicking at 40? Do you think that concept just doesn't exist anymore?
Yes, I don't think, I mean, I'm sure that it exists in society, but it's up to each individual woman to decide whether she's going to be affected by that or not. I mean, when I was in Greece, at 21, most of my girlfriends were getting married.
Colin, Elaine and Sue, programme 6.
I find problems about women.
Yes.
Deepak Nandi, tonight we want to talk about some of the great divides in the world today: sex, race, class, religion. Now, you're someone who's spent most of your working life in the fields of race relations, sex discrimination. From your experience, do you think that the prejudices in British society are particularly deeply ingrained?
Very invidious question to answer that. In some ways, one's inclined to say, well, what's special about the British? People are capable of being beastly to one another everywhere. There's a marvellous description by Al Alvarez, the critic, of coming out of Auschwitz with Sid Nolan, the sculptor, and simply recounting how Nolan came out and said, the bastardry of being human. And I always remember that when I'm inclined to say, well, you know, Britain is lousy. But I'm bound to add to that in my view, having lived in this country now for nearly a quarter of a century, that there is a sense in which I've begun to get more and more worried about the way in which the atmosphere begins to close in on one. A sense in which the British are perhaps today less sympathetic, less generous, less outgoing than I remember when I came here as a very young man in the 1950s.
Why is that? What's happened to us?
I think it's presumptuous to try and second guess the historians who will tell us in 50 or 60 years' time. But I would say, as a personal explanation, that like France, we faced in the 1950s a parting of the ways. The empire had ended, we had to come to terms with a new role in the world. France had its de Gaulle. For all his warts, a man capable of pulling a nation out of the whole colonial and the great power involvement. We had Harold Macmillan, the greatest showman of all time, and Harold Wilson, the second greatest showman of all time. But I don't want to jest. I do believe that in those years, which some of us now look back as being rather interesting, intelligent years when swinging London was the attraction of the world, I think it was in those years that the hopes of Britain for finding a new role in the world somehow foundered. And I think that makes it even more difficult in the 1980s, with all the constricting forces pressing on us economically, politically. It makes it more difficult for us to come to terms with a big wide world outside which is largely non-white, which doesn't speak English, which is deviant in all sorts of ways.
Do you mean that we use race as a scapegoat for our economic failures?
Oh, I've always thought that. I don't think there's much doubt that whenever it is that you have problems with unemployment, that problems of race relations get worse. And then you have the Select Committee of the House of Commons going round to Bristol to ask, you know, why did you have a riot in Bristol? Well, the question was, you know, why didn't we have riots everywhere else at the same time, not why did we have it in Bristol? I think racism is a scapegoat issue of that kind. Not just racism. I detect the same kind of constriction of attitudes in the atmosphere when it comes to issues to do with which are regarded as having to do with women. For example, issues which I've no doubt you've discussed, like the provision of childcare. 5 or 6 years ago, you would have found a constituency where you could have talked about a policy for more generous childcare. Today, people say, ah, well, you know, you can't go to the loo until the money supply has come right. Well, you know, that's the atmosphere we're in.
But the problem, surely, is not that when I first started off in terms of thinking about race, the British were a nation who would say that providing you accepted our way of doing things, you were welcome here. And to me, it seems today that what we're really trying to do is to say, OK, we're a multiracial society now. It's not a question of sending people back. It's not a question of saying how many are here. It is a question of saying we have black and other coloured British people, and that we have to plan a society that is about all races and all sexes. And that, it seems to me, is where the British founder. We don't seem to be able to do it. For example, for myself, I don't really know what it means for me to be a citizen in a multiracial society. How will I have to change? What things will I have to come to terms with?
But haven't we, in a way, in some of the racial problems, become a changeover from the strange and the different, and the difference being one of colour, to being subsumed in the general problem of class? Because while I'm not saying that racial prejudice and class prejudice are exactly the same or exactly contingent in this country, to a large extent, many of the problems that black people have are the problems of the urban poor. And they are the problems of the working or non-working, yes, because they're unemployed in this country. And it seems to me that we've adapted very badly, compared to some other countries, to the question of class. The class divisions in this society remain.
Yes, I agree with that, but I think that the point at which I would be inclined to stop, Helene, is that although there are remarkable similarities, too horrifyingly remarkable in some respects, between those prejudices about class and about sex and about race, there is this additional problem which I ought to say one word about, and that is that the ghastly thing really about society is the way in which you have a pecking order within a pecking order. That even within the urban poor, the deprived urban poor, you're more likely than not to find the blacks at the bottom of the heap. And I remember vividly something that James Baldwin once said about the Deep South, when he observed that for the poor whites in Mississippi or Alabama, the mere fact of having someone who was even worse off than you was the pole star in your universe. And if that went, then your universe collapsed. Now, I wanted to put in that word just to say that the thing is a bit more complex. But broadly speaking, I agree. I think we've been remarkably bad at adapting. I won't call it a classless society, because it's not that. But negotiations of class differences which make it less of an irritant than it is, for example, in the Netherlands or in Germany or in
I mean,
France.
you still go into factories in this country and there are still 7 canteens.
That's right.
Graded for
That's
people
right.
in different stuff, in a way that other countries would just find quite inconceivable.
That's right. I can remember very vividly when my first recollections in race of coming back from the United States, where I'd been taken down on the shop floor by one of the top managers of IBM. 95% of the shop floor were black from the ghetto. And yet this chap, in his shirt sleeves, walked around, knew everyone by first name, and no one's going to persuade me that the United States is a classless society. But I'm jolly convinced that it works a good deal better than ours does, because you have people who are capable of making, of what I call negotiations at that level.
Though in some ways, I'm not sure that we don't over-exaggerate this. The image of Britain as either the cloth cap or the bowler hat is, it's so profound. That's the cliche about Britain. And a lot of other countries have got over the sort of business of things like canteens, but you find that the class is exactly the same, that no higher percentage of working class children get to university than they did before the war in most European countries, that those profound things haven't changed. A friend of mine was having a meeting with some German industrialists, some sort of top management men who were saying, well, of course, it's very sad about England, but it's your class problem that does you in. And he looked around the table, and every single person sitting around that table was a baron or a von. And he pointed this out, and they said, good heavens, yes, what a coincidence. That in some ways what we have is a class system that shows more. But I wonder if it really is more profound.
I think you've put your finger on exactly what I was saying, rather better than I did. It exists everywhere. But given the fact that it exists, I think it's absolutely essential to find ways of negotiating it in everyday life in a way that we just haven't begun to do.
And for the individual, are we more immobile than other countries within that class system? I mean, as you say about America, there is the image of every boy can become president,
Absolutely.
any boy can become president,
Absolutely.
and at the same time we all know that there are poor, deprived, underprivileged people in America, and a large
people who'd be
number of
privileged to
them.
be a janitor.
Indeed.
Yes.
But are they a constant, or are they a shifting population? I mean, I feel that one of the things about Britain is that our class system is so static, that there's so little mobility.
It's not just about class. I mean, I think there is a specific about race too. And working a lot with the working class, the blacks are still the outsiders. And it isn't about them just being poor, because they are, but poverty is shared in the working class. They are black. They have different traditions. They have, I mean, if they are culturally West Indian and feel themselves to be so, the young men might wear dreadlocks, or they might have a specific culture which is alien to our culture. And the problem is our ability to recognise and negotiate with difference.
Yes.
And they are different people. And my whole take on it, and looking at things like race awareness training, all the things I think I ought to be doing, is to say, OK, I'm white in a white society. I might be Jewish, I might be third generation immigrant, but I'm white, and it makes me terribly different to a black at the same level. And what I want to know is, how do I have to change, how does my society have to change to make it possible to negotiate with black people?
Yes. Well, you know, I think that at this point you've touched on a series of really profound questions, but where I think we would go off the rails within seconds if we're not careful is if we still stick on the question of colour. Because if you take a particular example, what is the sort of thing that would divide a healthy white Anglo-Saxon Englishman or Englishwoman from a West Indian community in Handsworth, or an Indian community in Southall? let me give you an example. It is the way in which they regard the elderly, the old people. One of the things they find most objectionable, all the years I've been in England, is the way in which English society, British society, simply regards, well, those marvellous lines in King Lear, age is unnecessary. Do you know? 60 or 65, out. No place for you in organised society. And this is the complaint they have about English society. So anyone who has ever said to me, you know, how do I relate to them? My answer has been, well, for example, they might have something to say about age and about the elderly, which we might be capable of benefiting from.
Which we may need to learn.
Indeed,
But
indeed.
Sue was talking about respecting differences.
Yes.
Is there a problem when you're trying to be equal from the liberal viewpoint or whatever you like to say, that you're respecting a minority, respecting a cultural difference, and you come bang up against something that offends another part of your egalitarian personality, an attitude of a religion towards women or whatever it is? And what takes precedence then?
Well, there's no rule of thumb, but I think the only thing that enables one to answer that question is a clarity of perception about one's values. In race relations, the most difficult problem I've ever had to face are those late-night telephone calls to say that a Muslim girl was being shipped off on the next flight to Karachi, and would I intercede, please, with her parents. And at that point, I'm bound to say that although I would be the first to go out and preach for a healthy respect for Muslim culture and its, in all its aspects, I'm bound to say that I'm forced to draw back and say, I respect Muslim culture, but I don't particularly respect the way in which it regards women. And since it matters to me that women ought to be treated in a certain way, that is a divide which I must say I have not been able to come to terms with, especially in the last few years with the great Islamic rebellions sweeping through the Middle East, the Far East and everywhere else.
But that's one that I actually do tie myself in knots about that. And the only thing I can come down to in the end, particularly about arranged marriage and women, is to say that we've got to legislate for those who opt out of that system. We have to protect them. And I'm sure personally I would attempt to intervene in an arranged marriage. But I can't see any way that I could validate the state intervening to smash another person's culture if they chose to go through with it. And I find it very difficult as a choice because I want all women to have the right to choose.
But if they chose, it's not arranged in the sense that you mean. As long as the state holds on to the basic human freedoms, basic human rights, then there isn't a contradiction.
But I don't think that overcomes the problem, Polly. I mean, I think still people choose for a whole range of reasons, because parents expect you to choose because you're going to be a good girl or a good boy for going through with the arranged marriage. You may want that social acceptability and responsibility. Now, all my being tells me that that is wrong for people to be forced into making those choices. But once they've made them, my liberal self tells me I've got to justify that.
But we're all culture bound. We're only talking about the people who want to break out.
But it's interesting because I think you would be different. The state intervenes in lots of things that are culturally acceptable. I mean, it may be part of working class culture to get drunk on a Saturday night and come home and batter your wife.
Sure, I want the state to intervene.
And you want the state to intervene. But they're white, so you have no inhibitions about it at all.
Right.
When it's Muslims wanting to send their daughters to all-girls schools, you say, hands off, I must let this happen.
Yeah.
And one does it because you're tentative about going into another person's culture.
Point taken, Helen, but you would draw a distinction between beating up your wife and choosing a single-sex school. And I think on that difference turns a rather important point, I think, in the whole business of equality in this country, which I must say I feel rather pessimistic about, simply because of the constriction of the atmosphere and the sort of the draining away of the generous attitudes of the 50s and 60s. And that is that we have created a set of institutions which are committed to promoting equality. And having done that, everybody else is somehow in a curious way let off the hook. And I have never believed, although I work in one myself at the moment, I've never believed that state-sponsored institutions are the best or necessarily the most effective ways of doing these things. Necessary, yes. But having set them up, the worst thing that can happen to them is if the rest of the troops, so to speak, withdraw from the battlefield. And to deal with the sorts of problems that Sue was talking about, I would have thought that state institutions are about the worst things you can imagine for coping with those intricate arguments of persuading parents to back off for a few hours and so forth. And I think that this is where we lack in this country now, to be particular, a whole range of community involvement, and this too worries me about contemporary Britain, that the kind of civic decencies that I was familiar with in the 1950s and 60s seem to have been eroded.
But of course your background was rather different in that you came from a rather old-fashioned, very middle-class colonial Indian background. We've talked about class and race and how closely they're linked. Are there ever times when you feel more Indian than you feel middle class in this country? Obviously, with someone like yourself who's highly educated, one thinks of you first of all as being middle class and second of all as being Indian.
Well, thank you very much, but I mean every time I get into a taxi I feel more Indian than middle class. But
that does happen to you all the time?
All the time. Again, one of the remarkable things about Britain is that historically it's the society which has the most extensive historical knowledge of race relations, and yet it has been the one that's least come to terms with it. In France or Germany, I can get by simply by saying I'm British, whereas in England, the thing is unthinkable. I mean, you know, who would think of me as British? Yeah. So there is this curious kind of vestigial awareness of differences, of a kind which simply impede the business of coming to terms with who you're talking to and what you're saying.
Wonderful class, race, sex story of a very well-educated, middle-class Asian woman who lives here and was born here, coming back into Heathrow and having the terrible hassle with immigration that black people have, and being asked when she said that she'd been born in this country by the immigration officer, "Oh yes," he said, "and where were you educated then?" And she said, "Cheltenham Ladies College and Somerville. Where were you?" And it seems to sum up a lot in her very class-ridden reaction to him of what's wrong in Britain. But can I take you a bit wider? You mentioned the Islamic Revolution before. Is it just Britain that's turning in on itself or becoming more rigidly divided? Because when you look round the world, whether it's Ulster or the resurgence of anti-Semitism in France or the whole Muslim cultural revolution, there seems to be a resurgence of almost medieval religious divides.
I think I ought to distinguish between the Islamic revolution in consciousness, which is, I think, a problem or an issue to be dealt with on its own, and something I would have expected, I think all of us should have expected, with the worldwide recession that descended on us about 18 months ago. We should have expected a resurgence of anti-Semitism, of all kinds of scapegoating, and we should have been prepared for it. And I'm astonished that the French are surprised that it's happened to them. Indeed, had you examined French policy towards their migrant labourers for the last 4 or 5 years, I mean, the brutality with which the French went about it is something which I must say would have been unthinkable in Britain.
Yes.
And having said that Britain is worse than everywhere else, I ought to say that you know, there are some things, some battles we have won, and I would be very loath to see that ground eroded away. But it is nonetheless true that all over Western Europe now, you have societies in roughly the same position, you know, give or take a few percentage point differences in unemployment. And the question is, which of them are better capable of coping with the situation we find ourselves in? And I must say, I'm still saddened by the fact that the Germans and the Dutch still appear to care about the third world and about foreign aid in a way in which British public opinion simply doesn't give a damn. Now that not only worries me, it makes me feel extremely sad. Because, as I said, you know, the kind of civic decencies with which I was familiar, and wasn't just a middle-class thing. One of the anecdotes with which we grew up as boys was the occasion in the 1930s, in the middle of the worst depression that Britain's gone through, when Gandhi came to Lancashire and walked barefoot through the streets of Bolton, and the textile workers, instead of throwing bricks at him, applauded him. Do you know, I mean, what happened to that old English culture? That's what I want to know.
But what happened to it, surely, is that the entire British identity, given the loss of empire, the loss of everything that had been, the spiritual, moral burden of the British that fell apart, we haven't been able to build another strong identity as a nation. But I don't believe the Germans have either. I mean, the last time I was in Germany and I saw the treatment of migrant labour in Germany, and I think that is pretty horrific. And yet they have this interest in the developing world, the underdeveloped world, the poverty-stricken world that we don't have.
There is a difference between Germany and us, is that we are now being told that we are in a unique situation of decline, and that, quite separate to a world recession, we are actually going downwards, and we're going downwards rather fast in relation to other countries. Germany is absolutely at the top and still feels itself responsible in the whole North-South dialogue. Yes. There is no doubt as to where Germany stands. But there is beginning to be, or at least it may only be alarmists who say this, but there is beginning to be a hint of doubt as to where we stand, and we may be becoming relatively an intermediate economy. And therefore we don't feel those responsibilities. We should, because of course the difference between us and the third world is colossal.
But Polly, you say we don't feel these responsibilities, but frankly, if we go back to the Brandt report on the North-South problem, and you look at the scale of what's involved, you're surely not going to persuade me that Britain can feel a responsibility for Western European defence amounting to £6 billion worth of hardware to defend what? What the steelworks in concept.
I wasn't advocating it, I was simply explaining.
No, I agree with you, but I think that we have got ourselves into...
But it is interesting that we're not insular in that respect when it comes to NATO, but we can be insular when it comes to aid.
But it looks as if we're going to become more insular. The common market is extremely unpopular. For all we know, a future Labour government may take us out of NATO. Our politics are becoming more insular.
But look, let us not put NATO up as being the par excellence of internationalism. I mean, Newcombe is not the answer to international tension. And it does seem to me that looking at poverty as a problem in the world and looking at our relative affluence, which we still have despite the recession, is a very big responsibility. And I don't believe it's going to happen until we start looking at ourselves as a nation, our racial mix as a nation, and therefore our responsibilities in the world. And the Germans, it seems to me, are doing it externally, but internally they're still incredibly chauvinist.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I wouldn't doubt that. But, I mean, if you take something that is within Britain's direct sphere of influence, or has been until very recently, and ought still to be at this moment, how much have we actually given to Robert Mugabe's government in Rhodesia? £700 measly million. And we have just committed £1,000 million to getting a new lot of tanks. And my question is one of national priorities. Now, it just does seem to me that there is something profoundly wrong. And I think the $64,000 question is the one that Dickens was asking in the middle of the 19th century. Are you going to get a people, a society, to be generous to others because it's learned to be generous to itself first, or is it going to happen the other way around? And I frankly don't know the answer, but it does seem to me that the two are somehow inextricably linked up, that the narrowing of sympathies within Britain itself really goes hand in hand with the pulling in of horns from every responsibility that we've had for 300 years.
Do you think this narrowness is reflected in the fact that there's an attitude that if you've got equal opportunity legislation on the statute book, then it's there and you've got equal opportunity, which patently is not true? I mean, do you feel that there is a sense that responsibility has been completely carried out, and in fact it hasn't been carried out at all?
And that it's formal?
That it's formal. There's been no attempt at positive discrimination, at making up for past handicaps, and that without that commitment to equality within society, our own society, there will never be a commitment internationally to equality.
Well, I have not myself been very active in the international field, although I've maintained an interest in it, simply because I've never understood how one could treat a small minority of non-English speaking blacks as equals if one didn't recognise that the world was full of non-English speaking blacks.